Hey everybody, Tag Life Done Free. Hey, I continue the Star of the Beast series, and we take a deep look into the media, the relationship with the media, and the government, the different programs that went on from Paperclip to Mockingbird and how it applies to us today. So if you're interested in learning a little more about how we got to where we're at and what we can do about it, come on, let's check it out. You and I and the rest of the modern world are smothered with so much information. Most of this information is conflicting at best. How do you or I, or anyone else for that matter, make sense of what's true and what's false? The amount of time it would take would be a full-time job for almost all of us. The problems lie in the fact that most of us already have a full-time job and that we balance that with family and hobbies. Few have the time or determination to truly discover the truth. And this is why most people just accept the narrative as truth, because this is the easy way. Isn't it interesting that we have the whole world at our fingertips, and yet we are more in the dark than ever? Imagine if you could keep both mom and dad working long hours. Imagine if you could make them choose between their kids and the truth. Imagine if you could keep them all tied up with an endless race to the American dream. Do you suppose that their perception would be easily controlled? There is no time or energy left for independent or critical thought. They say that information is power. Well, I would say that accurate information is power and erroneous information is slavery. You name the major social media platform out here today, and I can point to a process designed to sculpt your perception of reality. All of this information legitimizes the ruling class. If we could change the communication structure, we could change the culture and, in turn, the political status quo. If we continue to allow the mainstream media and the major social platforms to set the agenda, they will continue to point us at things that increase their grip over you and me. The alternative future is one where the internet revolution ends the monopoly the mass media has and in turn ends our future of rot and stagnation. The powers that be will not give up the power of information easily. They will call for more censorship in the name of hate speech, misinformation, and national security. For most of us, we will all too easily take a stand with our chosen political party. As I've always said, your beliefs are your responsibility. It is not social media or the mainstream news' responsibility. It's not the political class or the educational class's responsibility. It is yours and yours alone. Have you ever heard the term mass formation psychosis? So if psychosis is when people lose some contact with reality, mass formation psychosis is when a large part of society focuses its attention to a leader or leaders in this case, or a series of events, and their attention focuses on one small point or issue. This is mainly accomplished by structuring events and repeating phrases and messages. People can be hypnotized and led anywhere regardless of the data proving otherwise. This makes me think of the Big Bear, the Wu flu, and even September 11th. A key aspect to this phenomenon is that the people that they identify as leaders, the ones that can solve the problems or the issues, they will follow that leader regardless of any new information or data. Furthermore, anyone who questions the leader's narrative are attacked and disregarded. This has contributed to our current state of divide in our country. This is 100% the plan to keep you hypnotized and complying. Does any of this ring a bell? Well, there are a few very important components needed for a population to experience a mass formation psychosis. The first is the lack of social bonds. Stay inside. It's the right's fault. It's the left's fault. You can't trust the police. White people are racist. Heterosexuals are bigots. The list goes on and on. Next is the lack of sense making, where things just don't make sense. If you can create mass confusion by bombarding our every thought with misinformation, we will be in a constant state of confusion. And finally, free-floating anxiety. is a general sense of uneasiness that is not tied to any particular object or specific situation. Do you guys know anybody who spends their time in this free-floating anxiety, just this unease of something isn't right? Well, I think that pretty much sums up 95% of the population today. Have you ever heard of Operation Paperclip? In 1946, the CIA recruited German behavioral scientists to help fend off the spread of communism. Operation Paperclip was a classified program to bring Nazi science to America right after World War II. Now, it was had a pretty benign public face. The War Department had issued a press release saying that good German scientists would be coming to America to help out our scientific endeavors. Now, never mind that these good German scientists were also, war criminals in many cases, even overseeing death camps, but that's for another discussion. As this top secret program began to grow, it was transformed into Operation Mockingbird. So Operation Mockingbird was a CIA project that recruited journalists to write fake stories promoting government ideas while dispelling the communist one. It was a large-scale project undertaken by the CIA beginning in the late 1950s, in which they recruited American journalists into a propaganda network. The recruited journalists were then put on the payroll by the CIA and instructed to write fake stories that promoted the views of the intelligence agency. Students, cultural organizations, and magazines were allegedly funded as fronts for this operation. And I know a lot of you are saying, man, that was back in the 50s, and that was a long time ago, but did you know that, you guys know who Anderson Cooper is, right? Did you know that he spent 2 years with the CIA before joining CNN with no journalism background? I find that interesting. I digress. Operation Mockingbird expanded later on in order to influence foreign media as well. Operation Mockingbird, or whatever it is called today, is alive and well. Are you familiar with the Smith-Mundt Act? So the original Smith-Mundt Act made it illegal to use propaganda basically against the American people. But in 2013, the big BO signed into law the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act, repealing the original Smith-Mundt Act. This is H.R. 5736. And this made it legal for the government-produced media to be directed towards U.S. citizens. In order to understand the power of the Smith-Mundt Act, I encourage each of you, just simply go Google it. And what you'll see is that everything that comes up decrees that the U.S. government does not use propaganda against the Americans. And it's all good and all well-intended. And, you guys remember the thought police from Orwell's 1984? The fact that the complete repeal of the original Smith-Mundt Act was deceptively labeled the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act should be a sign of our Orwellian future. A lengthy list of articles calling out the alleged piece of disinformation that the big BO legalized government propaganda against the citizen appears at the top of every Google search. The fact that the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act of 2012 was also signed into law as part of the National Defense Authorization Act of 2013. So let's think about this. So the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act, which made it legal to use propaganda against the American citizen, was signed into law as part of the National Defense Authorization Act. I find that ironic. But it establishes a full-fledged ministry of truth and the removal of you and I's liberty. Did you know that a newly created Disinformation Governance Board was announced at the exact same time as the leak of the impending Roe v. Wade reversal by the United States Supreme Court? Isn't that funny? Is that a coincidence? Most of you probably never even heard of it. With the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act already in place, guys, there may only be a couple steps left before the completion or the complete removal of dissent. First, they need to convince you and I, and more importantly, the lawmakers, that the Disinformation Governance Board is keeping us safe and that it is not unconstitutional. I think back to all of the things that they've created, whether it was, the Patriot Act or, the list just goes on and on, all under the guise of keeping us safe. And now they've come up with this Disinformation Governance Board, again, under the idea of keeping us safe. If the lawmakers can be convinced this doesn't violate our Constitution, then the final nail will have been driven into the First Amendment's coffin. What will follow is censorship of anyone who disagrees with the government, and ultimately the criminalization of those who persist in promoting the ideas deemed threatening by the powers that be. Can you imagine a single person being declared the administrator of truth? I mean, isn't that kind of like saying trust the science? Remember what happened from 2020 to 2022 when a single man, Mr. Ouchie, you guys all know who I'm talking about, was proclaimed the final authority on science. He was also proclaimed to be untouchable by the mainstream media. This is another example of the powers of the Smith-Mundt Act. The first generation of pandemic propaganda studied and then deployed the post-9/11 playbook. Do you remember in 2020 when citizens were told by Dr. Ouchie that they were facing something comparable to the Black Plague? And it's funny how the people in charge of all of this, the final authority on science or the final authority on disinformation, all agreed to these things. When in the end, a 99.5% survival rate, very close to modern day flu. It wasn't the Black Plague. We were told to cease all social activity and to stay in our homes, and nearly everyone fell for it. Lockdowns, mandatory vaccinations, school children forced to wear masks. Most citizens were willing to comply in a heartfelt effort to save their loved ones' lives. Fear. Throughout 2020 and 2021, the government media partnership informed us that citizens were not capable of doing their own research. Well, we're not capable because you keep us so busy just trying to keep up with the Joneses and trying to pay our mortgage and trying to pay health insurance costs and trying to remember the Affordable Care Act. Does anybody know anything that's affordable about the Affordable Care Act? Right? And even the doctors that disagreed with the public health officials were labeled harmful. And all of these non-patient treatments were so ineffective. And in fact, even they argued that it was poisonous that the government needed to ban them. Again, protecting us. Just like the FDA approved propaganda used to persuade and pressure doctors to prescribe and patients to ingest narcotics marketed as non-addictive, when in fact they directly generated the opioid crisis raging on still today. Remember young Hunter's laptop? Well, we know that the Hunter Biden laptop was neither planted by the Russians or by the Orange Man. Now, Mrs. Jankowicz, I hope I pronounced that right. This is the director of the Disinformation Board, and she said, back in October of 2020, that it was planted by the Orange Man, and the appointment of the Russians of the Orange Man into the election, that was fact. But the fact of the matter, it never took place. Any head of the Disinformation Governance Board, Jankowicz, again, I hope I'm saying that right. But anyway, the representative promoted the use of cloth masks and the need for mandatory vaccinations. They ignored the reality of natural immunity. Isn't it funny how natural immunity now can only be had with the vaccination? Anyway, they claimed that the Hunter Biden laptop was planted by the Russians. I mean, this is the head of these departments. They're saying this, right? This is the head of the board. And all of these have now been proven to be inaccurate. Let's take a look at some more current examples. I believe the government's position, for example, on the Ukraine-Russian conflict is opposite of the truth. Did you know that Big GW, right? Because I'm not going to mention their name, right? The former president, Big GW. But he is promoting the proxy war against Russia, and this should bolster our belief because GW, despite having wrecked much of the Middle East, now consults and shows support for Zelensky, who is, according to GW, the Winston Churchill of our time. The fact is that GW's own invasion of Iraq looks like not only the Big Bear's invasion of the Ukraine, but also some of Hitler's various military escapades, don't you think? By the way, do you know who else worked for Zelensky? Yeah, so the appointed by the sleepy guy, the Disinformation Governance Board Director, Janowicz, also spent time working for Zelensky. I find that fascinating as well. Have we already forgotten that the wealthiest military on the planet was unable to prevail against the ragtag Taliban in Afghanistan, and that we left them billions of dollars of equipment? I mean, they have modern fighting equipment now, right? The bulk of the voters get all their information about foreign policy from the government mainstream media partnership, and as a result, most people appear to be altogether oblivious to the magnitude of the corruption. The perennial philosophical problem that was addressed by thinkers at least as far back as Socrates and Plato's is that human beings are mirrored in opinion and belief. We could go on and on about these tactics used to subdue us and keep us divided and compliant, but instead, let's talk about the good news. See, you have a choice. You are responsible for your beliefs. Once they formed this board, right, this disinformation governance board, it went on for a little while and the public backlash was huge, right? And so the current sitting director of Homeland Security paused, is the word they used, the disinformation board, and they say it no longer exists, but it's sure to have been, brought back up under either another name or no name or whatever it is. But we collectively, we can join forces to create alternative ways to communicate free from big tech and free from the mainstream media and the powers that be. We have a duty to question what any of these sources tell us. We have a duty to question their truth, their science, and their narrative. Will the age of social media finally remove the grip the mainstream media has over us, or will it continue to erode our culture until there's nothing left but a boot on your neck? Which one will it be? Well,